So in March of last year, Brandon Sanderson broke the internet when he launched a Kickstarter for 4 secret novels which ended up raising over $41 million. Now, there are a lot of different reactions to this. Some people thought that this would change the publishing industry forever. Some people said that this was taking attention away from smaller authors. And the vast majority of people who are fans, such as myself, were just really excited to be getting 4 Brandon Sanderson books that we had absolutely no idea was coming. Yet despite all these various takes, in the years since the Kickstarter, I think there's been a really important lesson for writers that I just haven't seen anyone discuss. And I think that lesson is so critically important to understand from this event if, like myself, you're an author and you intend to be writing for the rest of your life. And that lesson is this. For me, the biggest thing to be learning from Brandon Sanderson's Kickstarter doesn't have to do with the money or the press coverage or even the marketing approach, even though these are all things that are really worthwhile seeing and learning from, since this was really a masterclass in executing on a lot of those dimensions. To me, the biggest thing that I took away was how much Sanderson seems to genuinely enjoy the process of writing. And I just can't emphasize enough how critical that is to develop as an author. Having been on my own writing journey for 10 years and having published a couple of books in that time, it's so easy for you to become jaded with writing, for it to turn into a grind, for this thing that once was so fun and enjoyable and precious to you to just turn into a regular, mundane, boring job, especially once it becomes your full-time source of income and work. And I've talked to a lot of authors who are like that, who don't really enjoy writing that much, who whenever I ask them, oh, how's the writing going? They kind of just sigh and they say, oh yeah, it's a pain, but I gotta get this book out by this deadline, I just gotta get it out there. And it really scares me. It really scares me when I see authors like that. Because sure, writing is not always fun. Sometimes it's really tough. Sometimes it feels like you're pulling hair out, like you're not making any progress. And some books are more difficult and exhausting to write than others. That is just a fact. But we get into this game because we love it. And personally for me, I never want to lose sight of that passion that I have for writing. So when I saw that Brandon Sanderson had written 4 novels in secret without telling anyone else, that was hugely inspiring for me because, as he said in the Kickstarter, when the pandemic hit and all of a sudden he didn't have to travel to do book signings and tours anymore, he could have used all of this newfound free time to just relax or play video games or, do whatever a regular person would do, having suddenly had all this free time come back into their schedule. But instead, he decided to actually use that free time to write a book for his wife.
I started writing it as a gift for my wife, telling only her, letting her read the pages as I wrote them.
And then after writing that novel and realizing how rejuvenating and exciting this had been for him, he decided to keep going.
And I might have gone a little overboard because I've written 5 extra novels in the last 2 years.
Which is what led to that record-breaking Kickstarter. So I know when I talk about the idea of enjoying the writing process and trying to focus on making the writing enjoyable, that is kind of a very airy-fairy, non-concrete idea. So to make things a little more tangible, I actually revisited Sanderson's Kickstarter and his announcement video for this, and I've pulled out 4 key principles that I believe Sanderson used to kind of reignite his excitement and delight for the process of writing through this Kickstarter. The first principle is don't tell anyone. It's very easy, I think, when you are starting out as a writer in particular, but also when you get later into your career as well, to give a lot of advance notice for what you're working on. So, you might tell your friends like, oh, I'm writing this book. And then they might ask, what's it about? And then maybe you get into a half an hour conversation where you tell them all the intricate nuances and details of the story. And there is a time and place where that can be fun and it can be enjoyable, but often it can actually sap your enjoyment of the writing itself because you're kind of getting your dopamine before you do the hard task of writing the book. You are getting this praise from your friends for the ideas of the book and the kind of concepts that you're pitching to them, but you're not actually writing the thing. And for me personally, I think it's really good to, as much as possible, not talk about the details of your book until you've written it, but to actually find the enjoyment of the process as you go through the experience of writing the thing. Because what you want to really avoid is you want to avoid getting all of this dopamine hit and this dopamine rush from people saying, oh, that's so cool that you're thinking about writing a book or that you're starting a book. And then you don't actually feel any motivation to write the thing because you've already received all the praise that you were kind of hoping to get from doing this writing task in the first place. And then especially as you kind of get, further on into your author career and maybe you've published a couple of books and maybe you're in a position like myself where, you actually have an audience that you can talk about your books with. It is a very fine and difficult line to walk between obviously telling, readers and fans what you are working on next. But you also want to balance that with making sure that you don't give away too much of the stuff to the extent that then it saps your motivation to actually write the book itself. And I think in particular, if you're starting out, if you're an early writer, I would strongly advise that you try to tell as few people as possible about your book. Tell them once you've finished writing the thing, when you actually have something for them to read. And that leads into the second principle from Brandon Sanderson's Kickstarter about how to maintain your enjoyment of the writing process, which is write for one ideal reader. Sanderson has said that, the very first book he wrote for this Kickstarter, he wasn't even really intending to publish it or anything. He just wrote a novel because he wanted to write something for his wife. And he's talked in the kind of afterword and foreword for this book about, how the kind of things that they discussed together or the experiences that they had in their lives kind of seeped into the book. And it's not exactly a one-to-one direct kind of transposition of his wife into this story or him into this story or whatever. But he has talked about how, he was always asking himself, what would make this story entertaining for my wife to read? Like, what would she find appealing in this story? How can I create something that feels like it's this personal letter from me to her? And I think that that is actually a really valuable way to approach writing in general. So, I think it's really useful with your own book to ask yourself, who is the one ideal reader that I am producing this for? And for me personally, I've had that process with a couple of my books in the past. I've thought to myself, okay, this friend, this is basically who I am writing this book for, not in the necessary sense of I just want them to read it, but in the sense of these are the kind of themes and ideas and settings and characters and plots that we are interested in these kind of stories, and I want to, sort of take that inspiration into this narrative. I want to write something that feels like it's been created just for them because it's this sort of special bond that we have. And the funny thing is, when you get really specific and you write to one person, you actually find that there are thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people in the world who are just like that one person and who find the same things interesting as that person does. So rather than trying to cast your net too wide and write a story that's for everyone, I think it's really valuable to try to narrow your focus and write your story just for one person. And of course, it's up to you whether you actually tell them that you wrote the story for them or not, but I think it's a really useful kind of filtering and focusing tool to help you write a story that feels so personal and emotional and just exactly what an ideal reader that is similar to that person you're writing for would love to read. Principle number 3 is to embrace your influences. Sanderson says straight up that Tress of the Emerald Sea, which is the first Kickstarter book that he did, was basically inspired by The Princess Bride. And in particular, he watched it and he thought, I wonder if this character did this thing instead, how would that change the story? And I think when you are writing a book, it's very easy sometimes to be tempted to kind of like bury your influences, to try to pretend that you're coming up with completely original ideas. But I often think that originality doesn't exist. And in fact, there was a really good quote, I forget where I heard it, where someone was saying that originality is simply undetected plagiarism. And I think that that is a really good way of kind of thinking about your writing. There's absolutely nothing wrong with being inspired by stuff and bringing it into your own worldview and kind of expressing it through your own story, because inevitably you are going to change things. You don't really need to be worried about the originality of your idea, because simply by writing that story based off your own life experiences and your own interests and kind of way of seeing the world, you are going to warp and change it into something that only you could produce. Plus, I think it's really exciting as well to look at the stories that you love, maybe the movies that you love, the books you love reading, and kind of set off on this quest to write your own version of that. For myself, one of the books where I definitely found this to be true was when I was writing Across the Broken Stars, which is back here somewhere. Oh, here it is. When I was writing Across the Broken Stars. This was basically like Logan, which is a movie that I absolutely loved, set in this space fantasy setting where people live on these discs that are floating in space, orbiting around this planet. And people basically fly through space on airships and Pegasi, and in some cases on their own wings, if they are an angel in this book. And it was really fun to kind of take a lot of the similar structure and beats of Logan and then kind of twist and warp them into this space fantasy setting with a kind of very different plot, but also a structurally similar plot to that story, because I really liked the structure of Logan, where you kind of had this grizzled, grumpy, jaded old man who was sort of taking this young surrogate daughter figure to this mythical safe haven that may or may not exist. That was a story that really appealed to me, and drawing from it meant that when I wrote Across the Broken Stars, I was so excited to pursue that idea and just to see where it went with my own characters. So don't shy away from embracing your influences, from asking yourself, what are the stories that I absolutely love reading? The stories that I want to know, what happens if the character turns left instead of right, or makes this decision instead of that? Embrace your influences and you'll find yourself far more passionate to write your books. And then lastly, principle number 4, do spec work. So I'm kind of misusing this term a little bit here. Spec work is mostly the screenwriting term for writing scripts without being contracted for them in the hope that you can then submit them to a studio and hopefully get them greenlit and turned into a movie. But spec work in general just refers to kind of doing things for free, not necessarily with the goal of getting paid for it, but just with the idea of exploring a certain concept or a story. And I think that when I actually analyze a lot of successful authors, there are actually a lot of people who do what Sanderson did with his Kickstarter, who write a short story or a novel that they actually have no intention of getting published, but they just do it to reconnect with that feeling of starting off on their writing journey and working on a project in secret, not really telling anyone else, and just doing this thing for their own delight and joy.
The experience of writing a book in secret reminded me of the early days of my career, before I published, when I could write whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. The process rejuvenated me.
And just off the top of my head, I can think of 2 other authors who did kind of similar things. I know Michael R. Fletcher, my friend who I did the Wizards, Warriors, and Words podcast with, he is kind of writing this fantasy story with his daughter right now. I don't know if he wants to get it published or not, but just this idea of deviating and doing work off on your own regard is really cool as well. I also know Gabriel Berg-Moser, who is an Australian author who's been a bit of a mentor of mine over the years. He once had this week where he just told himself, okay, over the next 7 days, I'm gonna write 7 short stories. And the intention here is not necessarily to get these things published or to get any sort of praise or critical reception from them or anything like that. It's just doing this kind of spec work to push yourself, to help you grow, to help train yourself, to kind of like give yourself more fun in the process. Because if you're just writing everything with the mindset of it getting published, sometimes it feels like you're a bit constricted or maybe you're a bit limited. And it's good to give yourself freedom to play around and experiment with different stories, different ways of expressing yourself. So those are just a few thoughts I had on Sanderson's Kickstarter. He remains my favorite fantasy author of all time and a massive inspiration to me. And I can't wait to read the second secret project, which drops very, very soon, a couple of days from when I'm shooting this video. On the off chance he ever sees this, I would love to sit down and chat with you, Sanderson. You've been the biggest inspiration to me as a writer. Thank you for what you've done for the writing community and for writing all these secret books and bringing so much joy to so many people's lives. And for all of you who are with me in pursuit of great stories, keep writing and keep striving. I'll see you next time.